And we are live. What's up, Gabor?
Hey, that's a tough question to answer. I will be looking at you for good questions because so many things have happened in Android lately.
Yeah, but currently I'm just. That's strange. I hear
Hmm?
yourself and myself. Wow. Just a
That's
moment,
weird.
we have some technical difficulty here.
Do you have YouTube open as well and then you hear it twice?
Yes. Thanks, Gabor. It's very nice debugging with you. Yeah, that's
I
exactly
also
what
started
happened.
having the same problems.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we haven't spoken for a while now, right? Maybe a year or a year and a half.
I think it's almost free, to be honest, for the live stream.
Really, 3 years? Wow, time flies.
I mean,
And
2021, I don't remember it, so.
yeah, and the reason why I wanted to speak to you is, well, I always like speaking to you, but in this specific case, what happened is that I published this article, um, The State of Native Android Development in 2021, December 2021. And you wrote, someone posted that onto Reddit, and you wrote some comments about that. Agree with some of my points, disagree with others, and that's usually the way it goes between us. So
Yep.
I think I'm more conservative than you are, and you are more on the bleeding edge of the technology. So I thought maybe I will bring you on, kind of have a discussion, see what's the real state, and maybe you will provide some more like the perspective that I myself lack because I'm more conservative and I'm very risk aware when it comes to technology. So, folks on YouTube, hi, thank you for joining. If you have any questions or thoughts throughout the stream, then like just write them up and we will try to address them. But before we begin, maybe just for people who might come around this live stream later and will not know who you are, just introduce yourself in like 3 sentences, 4 sentences.
Okay, my name is Gabor Varadi. On the internet, well, mostly on Reddit in this scenario, I'm known as Zhuinden. On Stack Overflow, I'm called Epic Panda Force, and I have been an Android developer since 2014. And I have seen things. I have seen things you could not imagine. Okay, that's a lie, but it's almost a Blade Runner reference. But what matters is that I'm primarily known for answering a lot of questions, many questions. It's like, hey, I have this weird bug, and I'm like, hey, have you checked this particular thing? And it seems non-obvious. Like a good example is that I navigate forward and back, and my fragments are not showing what's going on. And I say, hey, are you using a view pager? Because then I think you're passing the parent fragment manager instead of the child fragment manager. And they're like, how did you even know that? So that's the
Yeah.
kind of stuff that I think I'm good at. People think I'm good at it, and it's probably because I have answered many of these questions. But other than that, I've been keeping up with Android to like be able to answer more questions. So if you have some strange scenarios you find, then ask me, and I might know the answer, I might not. Just the other day, someone was sending me this exception stack trace. I need to tell you this one, saying that compose runtime internal error, please report to Google. And I'm like, I have no idea what's going on here, dude, but that's fine.
Yeah, we will get to Compose later in this live stream. I definitely have some questions about that. And I did try to watch your discussion with Florian about Compose, but it sounded like, like a discussion between two folks who already tried Compose and you went straight into the depth and very particular stuff about that. And for someone like myself who is sitting on the fence and doesn't know, I was lost relatively quickly, unfortunately, couldn't follow that
Oh.
up. So I've got some questions for you, maybe newbie questions. So, okay, I wrote this post and I thought maybe we will start with something kind of not very provocative, and that would be view binding.
Oh, yes.
So you wrote that ViewBinding is amazing, and I actually tried View. I mean, I've been sitting on the fence about that one also for about a year, 2 years, and then I tried ViewBinding in one project, small project in 2021, and it was relatively nice, really nice. But I mean, it didn't make anything that much better. It did spare me writing some amount of code. Let's say. Just if I need to throw some number on that, like let's say it spares me 5 minutes of work per screen. That's like worst case scenario, right? If you mix stuff up, if you forget something, if you have some runtime exception after find view by ID and you need to fix that, let's say 5 minutes of work. I think this is a reasonable estimation. So in an application that has like, let's say 40 screens, which is kind of a medium-sized app, that would accumulate to 40 times 5, that will be 200 minutes, right?
Yep.
Which will accumulate to 3
hours.
5 hours. 3 hours of effort. So it's not nothing, but it's not that of an improvement, really, not that of an improvement, not that big of an improvement. And in addition, my concern is that even on my monstrous machine, Android Studio sometimes lags. So I had to restart Android Studio just like 1 hour ago because I couldn't work. I was just typing stuff, and the editor will just freeze and show me what I typed after like 5-6 seconds. So I can't work like that. So I restarted it, and luckily it was okay. So my biggest fear about ViewBinding is that it adds some amount of background processing when you work. And given how slow things are, especially we will get to this provocative topic a little bit later, but given how slow things are, I'm just kind of really afraid to add any overhead when I work. So what will be your take on that? Have you encountered any performance issue when you use ViewBinding in your professional work?
Okay, so ViewBinding, the reason why I don't find that to be that much of a concern is because the R class, right? Like you add something like r.string, you add something to the strings XML and it gets automatically added to r.string whatever, and it uses that same mechanic. So in IDE time, that thing gets automatically generated, and as such, I don't think it adds so much that you would lose time on it, right? So
I will just caveat there that
okay,
one of the biggest problems with these R classes is that everything is kind of global, right?
Yes.
So it does perform some kind of auto generation on the fly, but this auto generation is really kind of naive and stupid.
Yes. ViewBinding is also very stupid. So that's the reason why it's not really an issue. But I need to add this because if you work on projects and you have ViewBinding enabled, then sometimes the IDE gets confused, which is that out of nowhere, for no reason, all your bindings show up in red as if it like didn't exist, and you're like, why is this happening? So I've had people tell me that they tried restarting Android Studio, nothing works. The solution is to press the Gradle sync button, and suddenly it works because ViewBinding is like this. It's a plugin, right, in the Android build tools. an Android Gradle plugin. So if you use Gradle sync, then it will stop being red, right? But you do lose time on that if you're like, okay, I'm just trying to like, mess around with the screen, and suddenly it all goes red. But it actually gets worse. Okay, let me tell you, this is like the dark side of ViewBinding, and it's just such a nuisance. It's like not a real problem, but it's annoying that if you try to commit with import optimization, when your IDE makes these red, then it removes the imports of the bindings. So one time I committed to Git, right? Like commit, push, optimize imports, but the bindings were red. So the stuff that I actually pushed up, it was missing the imports for the bindings, and it didn't work. So I was like, okay, well, that's something to keep in mind.
So basically, if you do import optimization on your entire project and you haven't generated this, the plugin haven't generated this
the
stuff in
IDF
background,
forgot that
everything
it's
will be
there.
considered not used and will be removed.
Yes. So
And
that's
then
what
I will add on
generates
top of
the
that, I haven't encountered that myself, but
You
I will
haven't?
add on top of that. No, I've used ViewBinding in a very, very like small project. But I will add on top of that that when this happens, when you have like an import and you use Dagger, then you're in real trouble, because sometimes Dagger will not tell, it will just tell you your components cannot be generated, but it will not tell you where the problem is. And Android Studio will not tell you where the problem is until you open that specific file. So in that case, you are up to some serious trouble. Might be, maybe,
Although,
potentially.
to be honest, the Dagger interaction with things, that's most notable with data binding, because data binding is actually using annotation processing. So if you have a binding expression error with data binding, not view binding, data binding, then that can actually make your Dagger classes fail to generate, and then you get something like Dagger failed to compile, blah, blah, blah. It's like 10,000 10,000 lines of code in the exception stack trace of the build logs.
Yeah.
And in reality, it's just like you're literally missing a property in the data thing. I advise just not using data binding ever.
Well, data binding is kind of a dead horse by that point.
I
In my
wish I still
estimation,
see people talking about it as if it was a good thing, and I'm like, just don't like use view binding
yeah,
instead.
folks,
If you
don't
want to
use
choose.
data binding. Please make us a favor. I hate it. Sometimes I jump into legacy projects, I see data binding there, and I know that it will be painful. So just don't. I mean, I
actually
haven't
joined
used
the
data binding ever. I kind of just looked at it, and it seemed as such a bad idea and even worse implementation that I just like, no, I'm not using that. But
You can make
unfortunately,
it so much worse.
I'm not sure. Like it was almost like the worst of it.
Okay, I will need to tell you two stories because it's really fun. So
Yeah.
one of them, I joined a project. I was hired there to make sure that stuff actually gets done, because people were like collapsing under the weight of the legacy stuff they inherited from a different project. And what you need to know is that it was a Java Kotlin mixed project with Rx in it somewhere, but completely misused. It was data domain presentation layered, but data sharing, as in like arguments passed from one module to another, was done through the data module itself with singletons. So like you can expect null pointer exceptions all over the place. But the worst part was the data binding part. You see, they were like, okay, so we have this system with which we can write code in XML. So what would you do with it? That's the question. What would you do with it? And what they did is that they put the state that should belong, well, anywhere else, to be honest, into the tag of the view, and we're mutating it from a binding adapter. Like, these things are meant to, like, if you have a custom property, then you would use a binding adapter to be able to keep that custom property in sync between the view and the class behind it, right? Like between the XML and the view class. But this is for custom properties, not for like randomly mutating stuff that from a function that can be run at any time. It's like, just what are you even doing? So
yeah, they basically transferred part of their logic into XML intentionally.
Yeah. But it's amazing because they use the tag of the view to do it. Like, they literally put in that object and then they cast it out. They are saying, yeah, on this edit text it's said, but it only works on that one screen. And I'm like, oh, why would you ever do this? This is so bad.
I usually find behind every single of these very clever approaches, I usually find some, if you kind of go back into commit history, like 5-6 years, it's usually some developer whom everyone considers to be like a genius, and they're very smart. So they try to outsmart themselves, inventing some kind of internal framework or clever approach to something. And then 5 years later, no one knows what's going on there. So that's kind of my experience with hacks like this one. Okay, so data binding is dead.
Just a second. On Android Worldwide in 2 weeks, I'm going to have a talk. It's called Guide to Destroying Code Bases, the Demise of Clever Code, and this is what it's about.
Nice. It's a free event, right? Everyone can
Yes.
join.
Yes.
So, folks, Android Worldwide, in 2 weeks, Gabor will show how to destroy your code base.
Yes,
And I
this
will
is
make
one of
sure
the
to
ways
watch
among
that.
many.
Yeah, well, people get very creative when it comes to software. Well, because it's
True.
software, it kind of opens everything, all the possibilities, and it's very difficult to kind of envision how your actions today will play out in several years down the stream. And that's why of the reasons why I am kind of conservative when it comes to software. I used to be very like I used like my first job, people hated me, and I totally understand them today because I was that guy who like came in and said, "Hey, there's this new ID. Let's change our entire workflow to use this new ID," and then I scripted everything. I didn't want to do any manual work, so everything was scripted. Everything was like Perl scripts and Bash scripts all around, and I could just go and invoke one script, and like 2 hours of work would be done. But then, of course, when we had to transfer this project, I discovered that no one understands what's going on there. Okay,
Yeah.
that was the history. Okay, so view binding. Would you like? I mean, I put a 3-hour tag on view binding, like a kind of a time spared when you use view binding on a moderately big project. And you say that there are some how do you call it? Some
Edge cases, I'd say. Like
edge cases, yeah, some problems that you might
something to keep in
encounter.
mind.
So most probably we will need to kind of cut that 3 hours even more. So that's kind of my point with view binding. I think it's very nice. I totally hate it when I get these runtime exceptions and I need to just restart the application just to fix something, some ID. But on the other hand, I'm so afraid of these edge cases and how they interact with other stuff, especially when it comes to like very complex stuff that involves like a runtime ID, some plugins, and coding. That I try to be on the safe side. But I do think that view binding is a very nice framework. Like I mean, it's so better than anything else that we've been trying to do, and probably the credit goes to Jake, right? I think he's
Yes,
the
Jake
author.
Wharton was the primary progenitor of this. And to be honest, it shows like it is fast. Like I don't think we can like subscribe the or prescribe the IDE errors to him. That's just like some minor tooling issue. But to be honest, I like how you get this binding class, which has all the properties of this view in a type-safe way available. Like I had something in the layout and then it immediately shows up. But if I remove or change the type of something, then it also immediately breaks my code at compile time. I don't need to run it. I'm not like, oh, this frame layout is now a relative layout or a constraint layout or something else. Or this thing moved over here and suddenly it's a runtime exception. Like, I also need to add that view binding was the primary replacement for Kotlin synthetics, which I don't even hear people talking about anymore. And to be honest, I'm thankful.
Yeah. Yeah, that was another fad that came very quickly and went off very quickly.
It went
Okay,
off
I
very
think
quickly.
I
Thank
think
God.
we beat this horse of view binding to death by now. So let's switch to the next topic that I wanted to ask you about, and that will be Kotlin state in Android development. So I will say something that people don't like here. I prefer Java only projects, and it's not like I don't write Kotlin. My current big project is in Kotlin. I just decided to start it in Kotlin, and this is like the first time I really write Kotlin on a massive scale, because usually I'm like jumping into projects to fix specific things, so I don't get a chance to write that much of a code. But in this case, I'm building like very complex payment application. So it gives me kind of opportunity to work a lot with this language and the tooling. And I must say that it's like very unfortunate in my opinion, because I absolutely like Kotlin, some of Kotlin's features. For example, I think data classes, they're the killer feature. For me, data classes is like number one. I just my soul thinks everything looks so much better with data classes. The code is much clearer, and what you can do with it, and the fact that you don't need to implement builders yourself. Definitely spares you a lot of, if not a lot of time, but at least a lot of mental capacity, because it's very boring and it kills your. It kills me from inside to work on this boring stuff. If you have a class with, I don't know, 100 data structure with 100 nested members, and you need builders for all of that, and you implement that by hand, even though there are compiler, there are like code generator plugins, and there are libraries like GitHub's immutables that do that for you, but then you are into code generation stuff. So this has problems on their own. But yeah, I like data structures. I kind of started to like some of the extension methods, like let's say like filter, even though for filter I every time need to check the Java doc to make sure that I know what it does, because either it's filters out or filters in. So I mean, I don't know.
It keeps the stuff that is evaluated as true.
Yeah, so I wasn't sure about that even now. So I constantly check their Java doc. I think the naming of the method filter is really bad. It should have been either filter out or keep matching, whatever it is. Filter is just very ambiguous in my experience, and a lot of other stuff that I really like, right? And then there's stuff which I find very unfortunate. And the two biggest problems for me, one is actually build times, right? So I have a monstrous machine. I work on this project, on my new project, and it builds like, it's not a problem, like 15-20 seconds right now, but it's a small project at this point, really small project at this point. And 15-20 seconds, while I know that the project of a similar size using similar tools in Java would build in 4 or 5 seconds incrementally. So there's like this knowledge in the back of my hand that every time I wait for the build, that's Kotlin's problem. And then there's stuff like slow syntax highlight, and you open a file and sometimes you wait for a second or two. Slow auto-completion, slow and very inaccurate, right? Unstable auto-completion when you write like three first letters of a class, and then for a split a second you see that it matches your class, but then the moment you press on enter, it just changes the suggestion, so you kind of left with completely different stuff and everything else. So that's why I'm saying that, in my estimation, Java is more productive for Android developers at this point, at least for myself, right? And now, after this long monologue, I will give you the time to oppose my views and explain to everyone why Kotlin is better than Java.
Okay, well, this is a really big topic in a way. One thing, the most pragmatic thing I need to say is that the projects I joined, which is that I didn't even start them, I just joined them. They were typically Kotlin since about 2018 or so. They have all been Kotlin. The only one that's like Java based, it was either a library, and the other one was like, this project has been in development since a long time ago, so it's not Kotlin. But new projects, I have seen them being written with Kotlin, started in Kotlin and not Java. So while Java, the Java tooling is clearly better, like the build times, that's okay. So I need to share this story. Back when I was like writing this library called flow zip tuple, so that you can zip multiple flows into a single tuple, when you were like writing generics up to 12, suddenly my IDE froze, but like completely hanged, like and once you killed the process and then you restarted it, all my code was lost. So I wrote the same code like 3 times in a row, and then I realized what happened. And the problem is that the reason why you type the code, it's 600 lines of Kotlin in a file, and then you wait like 5 seconds or so for the errors to show up. And it's because Kotlin C is running, and Kotlin C is running on the UI thread of the IDE. So the reason why it froze my entire code my entire project, the entire IDE, is because it was running Kotlin C, right? So when
Kotlin C is the compiler, of course.
Yes, the compiler of Kotlin. So if you consider that the build times are 4 times more, and to actually get the syntax highlighting and the errors evaluated and all that, you actually need to run the build process right there and then. It's quite significant. So if you use Kotlin for a long time, this is something we were discussing on Twitter, actually, that you just get used to it in a way. Like you're like, yeah, I wait 5 seconds for the error to show up after I remove this field. And I don't think that's normal. But in a way, it becomes the normal. I don't know. But other than that, Kotlin in general, like 1.5, 1.6 and stuff, like it's not shifting as much, I think. So this is something where conservativeness might say something different. But I think that Kotlin adds so much with especially the extension functions you mentioned, especially the collection extension functions like filter, map, not really flat map, but also which ones? I was also using associate by and group by. They are really useful because normally you would be like creating the map, iterating and all that stuff and then adding them all together. In this case, you just call one function, you pass it 1 or 2 properties and it just works, and it makes things much easier to read. And if you are confused about what associate by does, then you just specify the type that you get back from it, like map or whatever, what it actually contains, and then nobody will have questions. They just look at it, oh, this is really nice.
Yeah, so, map function is one of these that I came to like because I write a lot of observers. Like my code is observers, observers, and observers. And map function allows you to simplify this for each listener. In listener, call a specific method, just one single line of code. Listeners.map, and then call a specific method. So yeah,
and if you cool. take that all the way to the end, then you will end up with RxJava and
no.
Yeah. We will get there. It's fine, but it's fine. That's beside the point, though. So Kotlin. On top of that, Android X, like the Android X KTX stuff, it's pretty significant. So like if you were to use the Google ecosystem now, it's really unlikely that you would be able to use it in a proper way from Java. And I'm saying that because the canary bird for this one, if that's an expression, was when they removed view model providers off. And I think that was in 2019 or so. Because saying new view model provider .get is just so unidiomatic in Java that it's not discoverable. It just doesn't make sense. So it looks okay in Kotlin. It makes no sense in Java. And at that point, you're like, okay, so it seems Jetpack really is going all the way down on this Kotlin first path because the Java API is just not idiomatic anymore. And then you have Compose, which you just cannot even use from Java at all.
Well, this I think is not, I don't think anyone will dispute this claim. I mean, I knew that the moment I saw Kotlin, and I have this long series of posts with all my conspirations about, back then I already knew, like, people maybe don't remember that initially they said we are going to support Kotlin as a first class language on Android, but our Java commitment blah 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 blah. And back then I already knew that it's game over. It's only a matter of time before they will force Kotlin on developers. So that's not a question. I think the future of Android is Kotlin, but I think there are like, I personally felt that it will go faster. I felt that the transition will take 2 to 3 years, and then it will be so clear that Kotlin is the way that the question of whether to use Java or Kotlin will become kind of obsolete. But I don't feel I don't feel it's the case right now, because you mentioned, for example, libraries, right? So I've had a client, and at some point they decided to migrate their library from Java to Kotlin. Not very big library, several thousand lines of code, but they just invested a lot of effort into that. they've got zero benefit of it, and they started experiencing all kinds of weird issues and weird claims from clients, okay, from people who integrated their library. So for them, it was like net negative, like very big negative, because they've got zero from that. And even if anyone would want to claim that Kotlin is more productive, when you write libraries and SDKs, it's not like the app, right? You don't change them that often. You want them to be stable. You want them to be readable. You want them to be without bugs. But kind of being productive for an SDK, well, unless it's some kind of a visual SDK, which involves some visual components which change quite often. But if you don't have any visual component in your SDK, these things tend to be relatively stable. So these guys, for them it was like net negative with zero upside, like literally zero upside.
Ouch.
Yes, and another client, so they've had a relatively big application, like several hundreds of thousands of lines of code by this point, and they adopted Kotlin, and so they have this mix of Java and Kotlin. And guess what's their biggest problem right now?
Interoperability?
No, build time.
Oh,
build time.
yeah.
Build
I
time.
should have predicted that.
Yes, I mean, like they jumped onto that, and now when they like, let's say, when they need to work quickly, because there's some opportunity to be capitalized on in real world and business domain, like they're limited by build times, and it's really bad. I mean, couple of minutes for incremental build. So
Yeah.
that's my experience with Kotlin, and I really like this language. I mean, I don't like everything about it. I think that the decision to drop checked exceptions was a poor decision. I think that
That's
some
something
of
you
that,
get used to.
yeah, I got used to it, but I mean, I still miss them. And but in general, I think it's a decent language. I really enjoy using it. So just I don't think it's like anywhere close as productive as Java, and the autocomplete thing, it just makes me so
Oh, yeah, the
angry every
autocomplete is
time,
pretty
and I
bad.
cannot understand, like, it's your ID, JetBrains, it's your ID, it's your language, you try to promote all of that, just fix that. I realize that it might be more difficult because the language itself is more difficult, but you created this problem for yourself, so take responsibility, deal with it. It's just so annoying when I try to type something and then it feels like every minute I need to go back and erase the something that I've been auto-completing to actually like spell it in full, because otherwise it will just not find
Generate
whatever it is
nonsense.
that I want. Yeah, it's like, like, I don't know,
Like
strings.
actual nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, like you do some, I don't know, strings manager, and you get like security manager, phone like 1,000 different
And then you
suggestions,
type a
but the
string,
only,
and it
yeah,
auto completes it to string security manager semicolon and
Yeah, I mean-
security manager. And like that makes no sense.
exactly.
Why are
I
you
don't
even
understand.
doing this?
I mean, if you would just kind of write intentionally autocomplete to be bad, that's what you end up with. Like, you spell the type explicitly in name, but it still can't find it. Like, how bad can it be? So this kills me.
I do also experience this, and we were actually talking about this on Twitter, that the reason why I don't notice is that I just type it so fast that I don't even notice it, because I type fast. Like my word per minute can be 120, so I don't notice these characters that I need to type as an extra. But in reality, yeah, if I was relying on the autocomplete, this would be a struggle.
Yeah. So what else do you like about Kotlin?
Typed nullability. I need to jump on that because that was the biggest selling point. And I explicitly am saying typed nullability and not null safety. Kotlin is not null safe. Anyone who tells you that is lying, okay? This is something that people need to hear. And this is, I remember when someone got banned from a live chat for saying that Kotlin
It was
is not
Don
null safe.
Felker.
It was Don Felker. He was banned for saying that it's not null safe, it's just type nullability. So this is actually a topic that Google did not like to hear. that yes, you can actually get null pointer exceptions because you have latent var, and latent var being an uninitialized property, that's clearly a null pointer exception by a different name. And on top of that, you can have the double bangs, which is a totally okay operator if you actually know that it's not going to be null. But yeah, that's Kotlin null pointer exception. And the worst offender, which thankfully is gone now, and I'm still glad that it's gone, Kotlin synthetics, which was generating platform types. Because platform types, if you access it as a non-null, and it is actually null, then it explodes with a null pointer exception. And with stuff, I actually ran into this in production, which is really unfortunate. With org.json, it doesn't have the non-null and nullable annotations on it. So everything you touch on it is platform typed. So I was like, oh, this thing is not going to be null. And then it was null. And for getting a null value, you needed to use getString. No, you needed to use opt_string instead of getString. And I'm like, how was I supposed to guess this? So that's the kind of bugs you actually do encounter with type nullability, because it's not null safe. If you're talking to Java API that's not annotated, it is definitely not null safe. It's literally easier to get a null pointer exception than if you
and of course
Java,
the biggest problem is like yeah, and the biggest problem is the stuff you get from your server, from your backend, of course, because there, even if you use something like Moshi, and you you mix the names, you forget the proper names, or just your server stops sending something, or there's some contract that you violated because you thought that this thing cannot be null, and they changed it, and now it can be null, then you will also get all kinds of null pointer exceptions. So there's no, this was a lie from. This was a lie. I mean, I'm not sure we can call it a lie, maybe, but it was a marketing stunt.
False marketing. So
it was marketing stunt, and many developers just wanted to believe that it will be that simple. But it's never that simple.
It's not that simple. And to be honest, when developers say, I'm getting way too many null pointer exceptions, then in reality, it's typically because of process that problems, like initializing the fragment incorrectly, like passing it in as an instance to a view pager adapter, and then returning that instance, and then the one that gets actually recreated will be ignored after process that. So they get this crashlytic stack trace. And I have no idea how this property is null. And the answer, of course, is that the system recreated their fragment. Their actual fragment they created in the activity is ignored. And that's actually one of the most common such null pointer exceptions. And Kotlin is not going to save you from this. That's just misuse of the Android APIs.
Well, I wouldn't call that a misuse of Android APIs. I would call them bad APIs.
The problem was the name. Like, it actually is called get item, but it needs to be called create fragment. And to be honest, they fixed that in ViewPager 2, but ViewPager 2 itself is not more stable than ViewPager 1. So whenever I can, I use ViewPager 1 and suppress deprecation. And I'm like, yeah, this works.
Yeah. The deprecated is just a suggestion.
I mean, the more time passes, the more it becomes true. Like, I'm not even joking. Like, ViewPager 2 has such weird quirks that, like, internally it's a recycler view, right? So if you have two fragments, one of them is this tall, one of them is this tall. So you start out on this screen, and it's this height. And then you navigate to this one, which is bigger. And then you navigate back, and this also becomes this big. You can scroll all the way down. It's all empty space. And it's because this fragment alters the height of this one. And it's like, I cannot fix this. I literally don't know how to fix this without just reverting to ViewPager 1.
Yeah, this sounds like a very serious bug that should have been fixed. Okay, let's maybe talk about another sacred cow then.
Okay.
What do you think about coroutines, Gabor?
Oh, God.
Gabor is out.
I actually don't like coroutines, okay? Like,
don't say that.
But so many things are wrong with it, okay? Like, there's this meme saying that don't use exceptions as control flows. It's not a meme, it's a good suggestion. But when you look at the internals of coroutines and you look at its interaction with run catching, which catches exceptions, then if you don't rethrow the cancellation exception, then the coroutines don't cancel. And the reason for this is because they actually use exceptions as control flow. That's literally the foundation of coroutines.
Yeah,
So if you
that's
consider this, that on one side you have these things where if you catch the wrong exception, it doesn't cancel. You have these things like non-cancelable, and nobody even knows how it works. And then you have flow collectors, which literally freeze the execution, and you call a random function and you don't know if it ends in an eternal loop. Like, I use this in Compose. I'm trying to define something that I like want to grab the tab gestures, and you use something called a modifier pointer input for it, and then you call detect tab gestures, and it doesn't indicate that this is a terminal thing with the collect latest in it. So if you want to handle two kinds of gestures, you need two of these modifier blocks, because each of these codes are terminal, meaning they freeze the execution there. They never proceed forward. So I'm like, they tell me this bug. They're like, we also need to handle the tap and not just the drag. And I'm like, but I have the code right there. And then I had to debug that it just never runs, and I control B into it, and I see that it's a collect latest code because it's a flow internally. And I'm like, how was I supposed to even know this? Yeah.
I must admit that you spoke Chinese for me for the past 2 minutes.
Whoops.
I didn't understand much because I honestly haven't even tried Flow. So I've got a course about coroutines, right? So I'm in a weird position that I need to sell my course, but I tell developers that coroutines are the most complex concurrency framework out there. And
I don't have a course, but I do tend to think about it. Like, if I were to make a course, I would make two of them. I would make one for simple stack and one for Jetpack navigation. And then I would be like, use simple stack instead. I'm like, why do you even have a course for Jetpack navigation? And it's because there are these poor, unfortunate souls who don't have a choice.
Yeah, right? That's for sure. And this is very interesting because I'm really first of all, my impression of Kotlin, I haven't used flows at all, so I don't know about flows, because flows from my point of view is like RxJava. I never used RxJava, so I don't want to use flows as well, even though that's probably the most requested course from me. Like, when will you do course about flows? Well, maybe sometime in the future, but it's not very interesting, honestly, for me. But I do use coroutines, and the reason why I use coroutines is not because I think they are great, but because I get this feeling that if you are in Kotlin, if you write pure Kotlin application, then standardization is very important. So that was my point all along. It's very important to be standardized. So I do use some things which I don't think are like the best tools for the job, but just because that's the standard, and I know that developers 2 years from now will understand that standard. So that's why I started using coroutines in Kotlin, and that's why I use them. However, as I wrote in that post, and if I remember correctly, you agreed with this point. Tell me if I remember it wrongly.
I probably agreed, because as I said, I'm not a fan of coroutines. I use them sparingly sometimes, and I wrap it in a try catch, but I rethrow the cancellation exception, and I hope for the best.
Yeah, but my point was not that the coroutines are not very good concurrency framework. Well, I'm not sure whether it's good or not. It's a difficult question. What I can tell for sure is that it's the most complex one to learn. I mean, the time it takes to learn coroutines, and every single time I need to relearn. It just doesn't stick. It's not too intuitive, so there's no way it just sticks in your head. For example, all this stuff about cancellation and exception handling. Like, if you want to execute something simple, like, I don't know, retrofit request, yeah, sure, coroutines are great, one-liner. But the moment you get into cancellation or something else, like, good luck with that. I mean, you can write very short and concise code, which doesn't work, of course. But my point is a little bit different. I feel, and I wonder whether you feel something similar, I feel that coroutines actually, the adoption of coroutines actually slowed down, or maybe even stopped. So, like, Kotlin is the main language for Android today, and I honestly expected that coroutines will become pretty much the only concurrency framework used in Kotlin. Pretty much the only one. That was my expectation like 3 years ago, let's say. But when I look at the ecosystem now, when I look at what developers use, I look at the projects which I'm involved in. I look at the questions that developers ask, stuff that is discussed on at conferences. Let's say, even though that's a very poor indicator of the folks, really, like when I was a young developer, the first conferences that I saw, the first conferences that I attended as a speaker, I was very eager and I like that. But what you see at conferences is not the real software development. Like when someone from a big company gives a talk about the very best, the very new tool that they use, like literally no one uses that tool. Literally no one. So I jump into code bases and I still see like stuff that people forgot, like loaders, async tasks,
Oh,
like all that stuff. That's what people use today. Like even new projects that were started relatively new, like let's say 3 years ago, you still see all these old legacy technologies. No one cares about what's the new hot thing. But still, get back to that. I used coroutines because I thought that they will be standard for Kotlin. So I use them now because I think that will be the best bet. However, I've got this very strange feeling that their adoption is slowing down to the point of almost stalling, almost no more people adopting coroutines. And I just wonder, what's your take on that? And do you say that you use coroutines very sparingly? So my question
yes.
would be, what do you use instead in your Kotlin applications?
You are not gonna like the answer to that one. Okay, so
Does it involve letters R and X?
maybe. Yes. Okay, so back on coroutines. Yeah, I feel like if the adoption is slowing down, it's because it's kind of collapsing under its own weight. Like in terms of complexity, mostly. Like people still look at it, and you're like, you need to know about job, supervisor job, the scope, what scope, this context, that context. Where am I even running on? What cancels? What doesn't cancel? And you're like, originally the selling point was just saying that, hey, you can make anything asynchronous, which is already scary, but that's beside the point. Anything asynchronous and still make it look synchronous just by adding suspend fun, and it just works. And there was a time when the debugger broke from it. Like the IDE, it comes from JetBrains. The entire coroutine library comes from JetBrains, and yet the debugger just crashed on it. It was like, I have no idea what to do with the suspending function because it's literally black magic internally. And I'm like, well, that's great. At least Rx, it looks ugly on the inside, but at least it works with my debugger, right? But on top of that, actually, I'm not even sure if on top of that, just in general, like, I think that's the reason why it seems like people just aren't adopting it. But on top of that, though, Apollo 3 came out. Apollo 3 for GraphQL, and they have coroutine first API. So, and Retrofit also has coroutine first support. So in a way, it's there, like people can use it. I'm pretty sure there are places that use it. But on the other hand, a notable change was when Danny Preussler, who originally proposed in DroidCon Berlin 2018 that Rx is dead, long live coroutines. But now he's like, I don't really want to use coroutines. I would rather use Rx.
So he made the full circle and came back right where he started.
Yeah, exactly. And honestly, that's quite telling. Like, I really like the viewpoints of Danny Preussler because in many cases it's pragmatic. Like, if he says this doesn't work, it doesn't work, right? so in a way, I can definitely understand why people wouldn't want to adopt it as much. Like, I really only use it sparingly, and I feel like I'm hacking each time. Like, I don't think it's gonna be the concurrency framework. And back on standardization, that's a reason that I originally found to be like useful back then, but now I see that every library is just a new standard. There's this XKCD comic that says that there are 18 competing standards. Let's make one that handles all cases. There are now 19 competing standards. And I feel the same way about all of this. So that's why I'm just using yet another competing standard, which is RxJava, singles, and observables.
Yeah. And what's your what do you feel from your teammates? Are they happy with RxJava, or they kind of try to push you into coroutines, or maybe they would like to use something simpler, better threads?
That depended on the project and the team, but in one of the cases, like the one where I joined and it had this data binding and all that, and the misused Rx, they were like, "This is so bad," and I was like, "I can show you how to use this." And afterwards, I left because the project was over. They had to like take over maintenance tasks and all that, and I get this message on Facebook Messenger saying, "Hey Gabor, I want to thank you again for introducing Rx in this way. This is so much better. I love it so much." So like apparently it's really a matter of how you use it, because apparently you can use it in a way that you get code that you can actually understand. And my trick to that is to minimize the amount of state that is handled within the operators. Like, I really do enjoy having behavior relays, which are very similar to mutable live data, but they are Rx and they have less quirks. So behavior relays by Jake Wharton, just put stuff there, subscribe to that, and you get it. And then you don't need to worry about like your reactive streams canceling from an exception, because relays cannot cancel, right? So you just send the data in, it stores it, you subscribe to it, you can have all these operators, you can combine them, you get all the goodies of Rx, but without the downside of cancellation happening from an exception because a network error happened at some point somewhere. So it's like we kind of mix it, reactiveness for the data flows itself, but networking is not channeled into this reactive flow. Like back when Jake Wharton was having this talk about managing state with Rx, that was the opposite of this, because it was like the user taps this button and then network request happens and then this, and it was all one flow, and you had to handle all the edge cases that you had to know about publish, and you had to know so many things. And I'm like, we don't need this. We just run the asynchronous operation and then just save that result value into a relay and then subscribe to that. So like we break the flows into pieces that still make sense. And as such, people end up with like, oh, I understand this and I understand this, so I understand the whole thing.
Interesting. I haven't understood many of the things that you said right now, because
it makes more sense if you see code.
I mean, hopefully it will make more sense to people who use RxJava. So your recommendation will be to use behavioral relays
Behavior relays are wonderful. Yes.
If you use RxJava, then go for these topics.
Yes.
Okay, cool. I don't think I will use RxJava, so.
You should try it someday, but you should also try simple stacks someday.
I tried RxJava.
You did?
I even worked in projects that relied heavily on RxJava. That's why I don't like it. I mean, I get your argument that when someone who knows how to use RxJava and who is experienced and has the discipline to use this tool uses it, it can be great. Yeah, that's sure. That's true probably for all the tools. My problem is that most developers out there are not experienced very much. I mean, like, what's the average experience of an Android developer? Probably 2 to 3 years, maybe even less than that. Yeah. So they're not very experienced. And RxJava by itself, maybe it's not like coroutines and flow, but still it has a relatively steep learning curve. And therefore, most of RxJava code that I saw was really bad. It was really confusing.
Yeah, most of it is bad. And I actually agree with that. Like, with all tools, and this is something that people don't really know. If you watch the Florian talk I had, like the podcast with Florian, there was this notion I said about MVI that if it's this complex, then it has to be good. And then it's just so complex you don't even see the edge cases anymore. You're like, yeah, this works. Let's just work around any bug that comes up. And that's the problem with anything that becomes too complex. People stop understanding what's happening. But with Rx, if you use it correctly, it actually reduces the complexity, because filter, map, combine latest, switch map. That's practically the 4 operators you need to use, apart from subscribe and observe on, which change threads. And I think we pretty much defined the things I use every day. Like, there are so many operators, you don't need any of them.
Okay, great. And this is a very nice segue into what probably interests most of the people who will watch that. And that will be, of course, Jetpack Compose. So I have zero experience with Jetpack Compose, and you have a lot of experience by this point. So I would like to understand, like, maybe not going into nitty-gritty details, because I don't expect myself to jump and start coding Jetpack Compose tomorrow. But I would like to understand the general state of this framework and what's your thought about it. So first of all, maybe just tell us in how many projects have you used Jetpack Compose? Were these production projects or kind of personal pet projects and stuff?
Okay, good thing you raised that point, because I was gonna say one production project, but that would not be the full story, because back when they were like promoting Jetpack Compose before it came out, there was this challenge that write a timer with Jetpack Compose, write this dog list application with Jetpack Compose and stuff like that. And I did those because I was incubating simple stacks compose integration, right? So in a way, I have been looking at Compose since February last year, actually. I think it's February last year. But I was not using it in production. Then I did, however, write integration for it. And to write that integration, I had to understand so much.
What do you mean by writing integration for Jetpack Compose?
Okay, so as you know, Simple Stack is a navigation framework. And there was this ongoing trend saying that what if you could use just composables, one activity, and no fragments? And for that, I needed an integration that specifically to change between composables. Like if you move between screens, then you move between composables. And to handle that, well, you have to like support screen transitions, or so you would think, because navigation component doesn't, but that's beside the point. So I would think that you need screen transitions. You cannot just release an app and say that, yeah, we could add screen transitions because the framework we are using doesn't support them at all. So like, it's just like not even a crossfade. Well,
that's what I did. I did it twice.
You did. You did. Fascinating. I actually
guilty as charged. I told the client.
Actually
they wanted to add they wanted to add transitions at a later point, and I told them, sorry guys, like this is too late for that, because the framework that we are using does not support that, and it will require a little bit more work if you'd like to. But they said, okay, not that important, and we ship that without screen transitions.
Fascinating. I didn't think that, because they always want at least like this segue animation that this thing goes in, this thing goes in, and the other way around. Like that's the one that people always expect. And that's the one I typically need, like shared element transitions. I haven't really had a design that needed it, and the one time that looked like a shared element transition was not a shared element transition. So but we did that with custom views.
Yeah, I haven't used shared element transition as well.
Whenever I want to like make a button go from here to here, it does this, and it like just doesn't make sense. So I just like don't. I'm always surprised when someone manages to make it work, because it just doesn't. But I'm sidetracking. So back to Compose. So yeah, the integration, the way it worked is that in order to render a composable, it needs to exist. And for a composable to exist, it needs to be called, right? So what you need to do to animate a screen to another and animate that is to call both the functions for some time and then stop calling one of them. I'm not sure if this goes through, because it's kind of strange. Because like back with views, you would be like, yeah, I have the view is animating, and then you remove the view. You don't remove things, you just stop calling them, right? So now the question becomes, how do I track that I need to call this thing for some time, but then not anymore? That's the
actually. I'll just interrupt you for a second.
Okay.
It actually does go through for me personally, because I tried Flutter. So in my latest course, I wrote some simple Hello World Flutter application, just because I wanted to try to see what's going on there. So it's the same, basically. It's the same system.
Yeah, it is similar in this regard. I have not used Flutter, so I cannot really comment on the similarities. But I do know, however, that making sure that you are calling this function for a while is hard. And I will tell you why. And it's hard because originally I had if then call this block, else call this block, and then you just stop calling it, right? And I had to swap their order. And if you swap their order, they become a different composable. And it's because of how Compose works. And this is why whenever I talk about Compose, I talk about the nitty-gritty details. This is why I started out with that at Florian's as well, because it just doesn't make sense if you don't know this. So I try to make people understand that Compose is a code transformer that grabs the structure of your code and transforms it into UI, which means that when you have an if block, it has a different ID because it's in a different position in your code, and each position of the code is assigned with an ID by the Compose compiler. So if you know this, then suddenly it makes sense that if I try to use an if-else for these screens, then it will become a completely different screen that is being rendered. So what you need to do is flatten it into a loop. And in the loop, you need to identify it with a unique ID called a key, which is stable, even if you are navigating forward or back. And I had to figure this out.
And all of that you implemented as part of simple stack integration with Jetpack Compose even before you wrote any Android applications that would use Jetpack Compose. Am I getting that right?
I was working, I would say this was incubation, because there was this thing with the dog list detail and there was flickering, and I was like, why is it flickering? And this was the reason, because the state was being lost because it was a different ID. So eventually I figured it out, and some people actually use it and they haven't opened bugs. So apparently I figured it out, but
yeah, no bugs is definitely an indication of it's working.
Yeah. It's sometimes surprising.
So that
are
was
people
simple stack.
using this? Are people using this, or did I just fix the bugs? You cannot really know.
Well, you can, if it's on Maven, you can watch the download stats, you know.
Yeah,
see
that's
how
true.
many downloads you get. Anyways, so that was Jetpack Compose. And what about production?
Okay,
I mean,
so production.
simple stack is used in production, but I mean, applications-wise.
Yeah, so application-wise, I'm not using the simple stack Compose integration in production apps because I think it's like suicide in a way to say that I don't need anything and I don't need to interact with anything that exposes fragments. Like, this is just like, imagine this, we are 11 years into Android development. There's no way you're not gonna end up with like having a library like a material date picker or something, which is like the most notable example for a dialog fragment that you just pull in and use. Imagine that, oh, I cannot use this library because I'm using just composables and no fragments. Like, what? And then I want to like scan a QR code. Oh, it exposes intent integrator. I need to pass it a fragment. Oh, I don't have fragments anymore. So like, I don't know. This seems very risky to me. I would not do this at this point.
So I will just maybe kind of elaborate on that for people who might not really understand what we're talking about. When you use Compose, Jetpack Compose, there are several modes of operation, several modes of integration. One mode would be just to use Compose to draw the UI part of your applications. Basically, if you'd use something like proper model view controller, you would use just Compose to write views exclusively. That's one. Then you can also use Compose to write the controller part, model view control, the controller part. And that part of the controller is, of course, how you navigate between different screens, because that's the controller's responsibility to manage navigation. So you can actually use Jetpack Compose to get rid of all your legacy controllers, which will be like fragments and view models, and just use composables, right? Single activity, composables on top of that, and you need activity just to kind of set the frame, because in Android, activity is the entry point into your app. So what you're saying right now, you wouldn't want to use Jetpack Compose to replace your controllers because
it's extremely risky because of the integration concerns.
Exactly, because we have all this kind of ecosystem of stuff working already, and you wouldn't want to kind of cut yourself off it completely. And therefore, what's your idea?
What we did is simple stack, fragments, and the fragments hosted Compose views. So each of the fragments had its own Compose view. And so each fragment was rendering its UI as a composable, but it was still a fragment. It was hosting a compose view, right? So that was the solution. The project did not have views per se, just compose view returned from the fragments. And there's actually a small section on this in the documentation. I think my camera is blurry. Just a sec. It's still whatever. So where I was getting at is that, yeah, so there's this a fragment interoperability section where it says that you need to return the compose view and you need to set the view dispose strategy, I think. I'm actually not sure about the name, but you need to set it to be the lifecycle owner. And that way, when the fragment is like you navigate away from it, then the composable knows that it is now destroyed and needs to handle that. If you don't set this, then you will have bugs.
What kind of bugs? Like memory leaks or something? Stateful bugs?
State would be lost. I think state would be lost because the way it works is that there's this thing called the saveable state holder. And this thing knows that it needs to save the state when stuff is being removed, which needs to know when things are being disposed. So if you don't tell it that things are being disposed, then it just won't save the state.
I see. Interesting.
Yeah, just follow the guide. I have a compose fragment, base fragment. I don't like base fragments, but in this case, it made sense. So I have this compose fragment. I extend from that, and then I just have this function in it called fragment composable, and that's where I just write a composable, which actually isn't just written there, okay? Like there were some things that we figured out along the way that would just not scale at all. So the way we actually did it is that we reinvented layout packages. So like there was a screen and there was a package in it called layouts. And then inside that you had something called layout and the name of the thing. And that's the thing that you would show in the fragment composable. It was specifically moved into its own separate file. And each of these layout files had its own preview. So that when you open that file, you would see what this is. So you basically reinvent by hand how it works with XML, and that way you can actually work with it.
Yeah, I wouldn't say you reinvent because this sounds, maybe I got it wrong, but this sounds like a standard modularization of your code. No, I mean, anyway, you write components and you want to make them standalone. You want to make them reusable, right? You want to make them easily readable. So even when you write like with views or actually any framework, any UI framework that I've ever used, including like outside of Android, that's part of your job to make sure that you don't write everything in one single huge file. So this sounds very reasonable. So how did it work?
Compose theoretically makes it easier, but you had to think about it. There are these things that you have to think about in Compose, and that's the downside of it, but we'll get there. So how did it work? It worked reasonably well. Like what I tend to say, which I'm pretty sure confuses people, is that because of the way the preview works, like there's this live literal support, which means that if you like edit a number, for example, in an existing modifier parameter, then that automatically gets rendered in the preview. So like if you know that you want padding somewhere and you have already added padding and you have already built a project, and if you change this number, then it will update the preview. But somehow, it almost takes more time for me to get pixel perfect design and the margins correct and the paddings correct because of waiting for the build, waiting for this, waiting for that, previews freezing my tab. I have to restart the IDE.
How often this happens that you need to restart your IDE?
I think it was 3 times a day.
3 times a day?
3 times a day. Like you have the preview open and eventually you just cannot open the tab. And then you close the tab, you double click on the file and it just doesn't open. So I'm like, okay, I will just restart.
Wow.
And yeah, I was also just as astonished. I was like, what?
That's kind of odd. Okay. And what are the benefits in your estimation?
Hold on a second. That's a jump. That's a jump compared to where I am right now. So I was messing around with padding so much. It's ridiculous. Like they said that it will speed things up, but just this part of it slows it down. And on the other hand, I had this slider component, this completely custom slider component where you have to like tap, drag, touch handling and all that.
Which, by the way, is hell of a difficult to implement in Android, in UI, in the classical UI framework.
That thing I implemented in like 15 minutes. And it had accessibility support, because setting accessibility is just modifier semantics, progress semantics, and it's 3 lines of code, and it just works. And I was like, how is it possible that I need to mess around so much with padding that it's ridiculous, that it literally makes everything slower? And on the other hand, I have this extremely complex, well, not extremely complex, but it's a fairly complex component, and I implemented it in 15 minutes, and it has safe state support, accessibility support, and it just works. And I'm like, how? It's such a mixed bag. Like Compose in theory, what it does, as it is like a code transformer that like generates code based on the code structure, and then it handles any changes that are made to the code structure with that code they generated based off of your code. I think that was a bit confusing, but it's fine. So what happens there is that state is automatically propagated. So the thing that you were trying to get with data binding back in the day, that you would set this property and it receives that this property has changed, and it would automatically reevaluate the binding expressions, right? That's what data binding was doing. But this is what Compose is doing as well. It has an ID for each view. It checks the incoming parameters. If any of them have changed, then that thing will change. That's what Compose is doing. So it's practically two-way data binding at all times against your model classes.
But we are working on not inside the Compose compiler or runtime or whatever it's called. I mean,
Yes.
As a developer, when you write a code and you wrote some production Compose code, like overall, if you would need to kind of decide for a new project, and let's say, let's make it easy for you. This project does not have, it's a simple project, like no integrations, no funny things, like relatively standard business UI, some animation here and there, buttons, text views, images all over the place without much custom UI. So like, what would be your kind of train of thought when you would evaluate whether to use standard classical UI framework or switch to Compose? What would be the like pros and cons?
Me coming from a meeting that was about this like 3 hours ago, and it was real in production. So
great, so you can just share your meeting notes with us.
Pretty much, almost. So what you need to consider about Compose is that the Compose compiler has a specific version lock on a specific minor version of Kotlin. So if you know that you are using Compose, then you will be logged to a specific version of Kotlin, which means that if you ever need to update Compose because it has bugs or it has a new feature like, lazy list item animations, then you need to update. And when you need to update, you need to update Kotlin. So in this particular case, you would need to go from 1.5.31 to 1.6.10 using the misaligned version numbered Compose compiler RCO2, so that you can actually use 1.6.10 instead of 1.6.0, which broke Moshi. So if you know this sort of thing, then you know.
And then, of course, some other libraries will break once you switch to the latest version of Kotlin.
It can, like with 1.6, they actually did break, and there are times when you like have. That's a different downside. Let's go with it. So like you have the Compose ecosystem, let's say, but they inherited the verse from Coroutines, which is that like half of it is marked experimental, and it just propagates all over your code unless you like explicitly opt in with Kotlin compiler flags and get, I am opting in, please leave me alone with this annotation. So experimental material, experimental animation, experimental, I don't even know. There's all kinds of them. There's like 6 of them at least. It's like, it's really all of this experimental. Like this thing is supposedly stable. You released it in June. but was it August? I think it was August. It wanted to be June. Anyway, so this is something to keep in mind. You have this version log. So if you wanna use this long term, then you need to consider that, yeah, when you will need to update stuff, then things will break. And it has to be a specific minor version of Kotlin, right? So you cannot even be like, oh, this Kotlin version has a new thing I want, but I cannot use it because Compose locks me to this specific version. And this makes you wonder about external libraries written with Compose. Okay, if it was written for this version of the Compose runtime, then will I be able to even run this, especially knowing that stuff is experimental? And the animation support is also experimental. So Jetpack navigation, for example, didn't implement animations between screens because it's experimental. So they moved that into Accompanist, which is like a first-party, third-party incubator project. It's not an official Jetpack thing. So they have that there saying that, but you can use this until we actually make it work. And I'm like, I'm not using this. So
yeah, it reminds me of when they wanted to, they at some point, you remember that maybe 5-6 years ago, when people said we want to use bottom tabs for navigation, like in iOS, they said, no, our style guide is to use top tabs, right? And then about 2 years
and
ago,
layouts.
And drawer, yeah, navigation drawers, of course, all over the place, regardless of how complex your app. That's actually what I implemented in my very first app. And I was very proud of that because I actually managed to make it work. Anyways, and then about 2 years ago, they said, oh, you know what? These bottom tabs that iOS have been using for years now, it's actually not that bad of an idea. But unfortunately, we don't have anything that actually implements that. We kind of adopt it as an official pattern, but nothing to work with bottom tabs. And then they came out with some bottom tab. I don't remember how it was called, but
I
didn't
think
support
bottom navigation view in the material components.
Something like that.
That's
but it didn't support so-called how do you call it when it has multiple backstacks for fragments.
Oh man, that's a different thing. There's something more interesting it didn't support, which is to have the labels under the icons. It was not able to do that. You had to use reflection and call something called disable shift mode true with reflection, and that was the way.
Yeah, but that's actually that's okay. But I mean, they didn't support multiple backstacks for fragments, so you couldn't actually implement this pattern, which they said they recommend. You actually couldn't because it would lose the state. And so their solution was basically to publish some code and tell everyone, okay, you copy paste this into your project and hope it works.
Oh yeah, the navigation advanced sample. I actually kind of forgot about that. But the fascinating thing about that,
by the way, I refactored that thing when I saw it. It was so bad. I refactored it. And I think I ended up with half of the code and much better architecture because they use this extension function. I don't know why would anyone use extension function.
They will use live data in there, and this has nothing to do with either live data or the thing you're trying to solve.
Yeah, it was absolute disaster. Yeah, completely. So from what I get, if you want to use Compose and get some transitions, you basically use something similar.
Well, it's not even like that. So it's a library and it's com.google. So it comes from Google and they do point to it, but practically if you observe the solution as it is and what it is, then what they're saying is that, yeah, it's not done, but we have this incubator project. Please pull that in. And instead of nav host coming from the navigation component, which is almost stable, like it's RC01, so we know it's not going to change. So instead of this nav host, you can use this incubator one called animated nav host and hope for the best that it works because it's an incubator project, so we have no guarantees.
Okay. Interesting. What else came up in that meeting when you decided whether to use Compose or
okay,
not?
So yeah, so what came up? Just a moment, let me think. So the question there was that, if we need teaming, like teaming support with the design system, then is it easier to do it with Views or with Compose? And we opted that it's theoretically easier with Compose. Like if you want to make reusable components, then that's easier in Compose because of how because of the way the composables expose their state and the way that you don't need stylables and extend from base, save state, and all that. You use remember savable and it works. But more importantly, it's just easier to get stuff into a composable. Like as you don't have stylables, you don't have the styles XML, the theme XML. The theme is not
basically
bound. It's not bound to the activity context, which themes are. So like, would you even use the built-in theming support? It's kind of wonky. So so as such, we were like, well, if you need that, then we can consider to use Compose. And it's like, okay, so is it a high-risk project? And how much complexity are we allowed to bring into the system by adopting a framework that is so new that people don't know how to use it? And this was actually a key point because there are two projects incoming. One of them we're like, yeah, we should do it with Views because, well, it's a thing that works. There's no quirks. It just works. Like there, you don't need to like debug constraint layout errors. You don't have like Compose runtime internal errors, which I didn't get, but I did see someone else get. Like you don't have this stuff. You just use the view as you always did, and it just works, right? So in one of the projects, we're like, yeah, simple animations, which means that, yeah, we should definitely go with Views because animations, people tell you that how easy they are in Compose. I have the opposite experience. Like I had to switch between two screens. It took me 2 weeks to figure it out. And the way it eventually works is, well, I had to understand how this key stuff works, the assigned IDs and all that. For loop, inside the for loop, you always need a key because otherwise it will just break, right? And on top of that, so the final animation support I ended up with is that there's a number, a float going from 0 to 1, and then you add an modifier that does something with it. So like modifier offset, and then you actually like use this interpolated value to calculate the current translation X. Like you had object animator back in the day. I was using this library called.
So what you say is that it's not even evident that something like animations, which honestly after trying Flutter, there it works quite well. I wouldn't say it's really intuitive to someone coming from Android because it's completely different system. Like you said, it's based on functions and this huge hierarchies of nested code, which honestly I think it's one of the biggest drawbacks there because it's just unreadable. It's just a mess. You look at that and you don't know where to start to read that. But when you write it, it feels good.
Yeah.
So you say that it's not even evident that in Compose doing something like animation is simpler. So you've had two projects. For one of them, you decided to use legacy UI framework, and for another one,
for that one, we are using Compose because you have the design system, and yes, it's okay to bring in extra complexity in this project for reasons that are nefarious. I think I will just not go into that. But well, as I said, you need to understand Compose to be able to use it. So the easiest way to have that is to ask people who know how to use Compose. So if you have a I'm actually going into it, aren't I? Okay, so if you have a support contract, then it's pretty useful that you can like say that, yeah, we will help you fix this because, well, it's Compose based and we have experts in Compose.
Yeah, I think that's like the industry best, like standard operational procedure. So it's not something
so you
new.
create something that's complex enough to sell it. That's what multiple big firms actually do. So in a way, becoming a Compose expert and selling your time to be a Compose expert is a pretty good way to earn money. So
yeah, we'll also discuss a little bit later Kotlin multi-platform. So maybe there.
Geez.
So maybe
oh
there
man,
it
the
will
whole
also.
thing is alpha.
Yeah, but before I don't want to leave Compose world just yet. What I wanted to ask you is that many people, like myself, for example, I literally one of my clients came to me and they said like, we would like to evaluate Jetpack Compose. We heard that it's the future of Android, so we would like to make sure that we are blah blah blah. And so I have real opportunity to kind of get paid to learn Compose, which is like not bad at all.
Yeah.
So my question would be, let's say I don't want to go all in on Compose. Let's say I want to implement just couple of screens using Compose. Do you see any downsides to this approach? Because, well, that's for me personally, but I know for sure that no matter what we say here, no matter what we say, hundreds of thousands of developers already bring Compose into their code bases. So it's like, I don't know, I've been fighting this for years, and I'm not sure that I managed to convince even one single person. Like every time some new thing comes out and I say like, wait a second.
You should see this for what it is first.
Yeah, by the time I complete the sentence, like 100,000 developers already code this thing in production. So Compose will be adopted. It's not a question even. So let's say we realize that. And in my estimation, it will be great if developers before jumping into Compose will try them in their pet projects, but this is not going to happen for most part. So we're left with incremental introduction of Compose. So let's say we want to write 1, 2, 3 screens inside our app with Compose to just see how it goes. What would be your recommendations, and what would you want to warn us about before we embark on such a journey?
Well, I already did. If you introduce Compose, you are logged onto a specific Kotlin version. This is something that I think is a major drawback that everyone needs to keep in mind. So even if you are like, I want to implement this one screen, you are pulling in the entirety of Compose, and you are locking yourself to a specific Kotlin version. So
here's my question. Here's my question. Is there something you can do, let's say modularization wise? Just throw all the Compose code into a standalone module and then somehow hack specific Kotlin version there and expose something which does not depend on a specific Kotlin version.
I think so. I'm not sure what the Compose runtime does when there's a mismatch in this case, but theoretically it's supposed to work. Otherwise, we have a really big problem on our hands eventually. But yeah, theoretically, you should be able to like cut it off with modularization and enable Compose only in this part of the code and then not need it over here. Although it's kind of hard to tell how exactly that would happen, because you need to have a Compose view in order to show it, and for the Compose view to work, you have to enable Compose. So I guess if you expose a fragment from a different module, then that can use Compose. But yeah, so I don't think you will be able to expose a composable,
most probably you will not get away. Well, when I think about it right now, I don't think you will get away with that, because you will most probably need to standardize your Kotlin version for the plugin for the entire project.
Most likely, yes, actually, yeah.
Okay, so let's say I'm starting to integrate Compose tomorrow. How should I proceed with this?
Well, I also did tell you earlier what my recommendation is, which is that if you want to do something like n composables, 0 fragments, 1 activity, just use fragments, please. Don't screw yourself over long term. However, especially seeing the comments on the YouTube chat, I don't know if you were looking at them. Here's this one comment. We should totally show the last one. I think that's very interesting.
About Compose navigation?
Yes.
I'm using Compose navigation. I picked it up early and had so many issues and have all sorts of weird workarounds for parseable arguments.
Yeah.
Well, so like the first problem is that you use parseable arguments.
The serializable would not help you here. I'm not joking. Okay. You don't know.
I don't know anything about Compose.
Oh my God. Okay. So back on track about the n-composable 0 fragments thing. Whenever I think about it, I tend to
just a second. I realize let's set a stage. I realize that many people might not understand what we're talking about at all. So in Android, you use parsellables. These are kind of serializable data structures. If you want to convey information from one place to another, you kind of serialize it into parcelable, and on the other side, you can take it out from that parcelable. And there's also alternative container for information, which is Java serialization, serializable interface. And this works automatically, and it's actually very good. I use it, well, I've been using it from the first day as an Android developer. I had a short romance with parcellables, and then I realized that they're way too complex. So today I'm just using serializables for conveying data inside the app, but not for, let's say, serializing data into persistent storage or stuff like that. That's not something you should use serializable for. But if you want to pass an argument, let's say from activity to fragment, or from active fragment to dialog fragment, I use serializable. And yes, go on.
I actually forgot to mention among the Kotlin benefits, there's this thing called the Kotlin Parcelize plugin, Parcelize. And the way it works is that you just say annotation parcelize on something that implements parcelable, and it just works. It's magic. So
like generation.
Yeah, it is code gen, but you don't really see it. So you don't need to think about this creator and parcel constructor and all that, because Kotlin can generate it with parcelize. And I think that's actually wonderful. I use it all the time. Like the navigation in Simple Stack, I use it with parcelize data class with parcelable, and that's it. And that's what I use pretty much always since like 4 years ago or something. So so that's really nice. However, you have Navigation Compose, which is a wholly different beast, and I will get there quite soon. So if you want to integrate Compose, you would use it by having a fragment. It has a Compose view in it. You can do anything with that. Like you can actually interop with views from composables. Like there's a specific composable called Android View, and we actually needed this. We actually needed this in production, and the only thing that we needed as a hack was we had to add a handler post somewhere, but I don't even know. It worked afterwards. But other than that, it works. It just works. So you can actually integrate older, view-based code into a composable if nothing else
this
helps.
Goes back to your argument about the existing ecosystem of frameworks, libraries, etc.
Yeah. So if you think about that, that's really nice. So you definitely can, if you are okay with the version lock and you just want to use it for UI stuff, yeah, sure, you can. It's honestly what I said about it being like two-way data binding at all times, that's what it offers. So if you had problems with that, your UI is out of sync with what is on the screen, your UI is out of sync with what your actual state is, well, you cannot have that in Compose, because Compose literally transforms your code as it is in its current state into the UI. So you cannot be out of sync. If you are out of sync, then things just don't show up. It's literally impossible for it to be out of sync, right? So as such, it does offer benefits in this regard. The preview obviously is kind of slow, and you need to mess around with padding, because there's no such thing as margins. There's things like you add the padding, you add the background, and then you add the padding. And then the first padding is margin, and the second padding is padding. And then you need to do the mental math for just how much is this really. And so that's a thing. But
so there's no external constraints for the elements. You only, if you want to implement external constraints, you basically nest elements inside other elements.
So I think it's fine. Like animation support, everything that's in Compose is experimental in that regard. So I just don't use those, which is why I went with the animated float approach, interpolate from 0 to 1, because that's the only thing that's like stable animation in Compose. At that point, well, that's something that won't break with the next big change, when they're like, well, we are no longer experimental. We are bringing out coroutine scopes. This is what everyone wanted. Not really. So, there are no guarantees. It's more experimental. You don't know.
And do you happen to know if there are any build time penalties when you use Compose?
I didn't really check, because the IDE lag was so significant that the build times didn't matter.
I see.
But that's just my personal take on it. Maybe my machine is not a monster.
I mean, ID definitely lags, even
It
for
lags.
me.
Yeah, like there were times when I was like, okay, I need to code, so I'm just closing the preview tab so it doesn't try to re-render them after every keystroke. I'm like, please add a debounce or something. This is ridiculous.
I see. Okay, by the
But
way, Compose does not support like Flutter. Flutter supports hot reload. So basically, you just type and it automatically updates on your emulator or device. Compose does not do that. You only
Compose has
see the
live
preview.
literals.
Yeah,
Compose has
just
live
the
literals,
preview,
and
right?
it doesn't hot reload on device now.
Yeah, so I guess that will be something they should absolutely do because, and
They're trying.
this brings us back to this comment. Jetpack Compose, same icon, image of shit in a different way. I will learn it when it gets full multi-platform. Flutter is looking better every day, so I'm thinking of jumping ship. And I was skeptical about Flutter. I'm still skeptical about Flutter. But what can I say after toying with it a bit? It does feel like the best option for multi-platform today.
Yeah, if you cannot afford to have someone write the Android and one the iOS, then Flutter is technically more stable. Like they wanna sell KMM, saying that yeah, you should just use it in production. It's alpha, guys. It's been alpha for 3 years. Your build tool, it looks alpha. Okay, like you look at the Gradle configuration, you need to make it work, and then you watch the talks where like, yeah, we are using it in production. You know how it works? They literally like KMM
You
code
use sorry,
sharing.
you
I
use
didn't.
it.
I
Ah,
didn't. No, no,
you
no, no, no. Well, there was one project where they were using it, but I didn't really need to touch it. So, but you look at the Gradle and you're at the Gradle configuration for it, and I'm like, I don't want this.
Yeah,
If I
I
have a
actually
choice, I
have
don't want
one
this.
pet project in Kotlin multi-platform.
You do.
Yeah, it's not live on Play Stores. It's just something I write for myself, and it doesn't have iOS part at all. I just used Kotlin multi-platform, all this Gradle setup and set up into like expected action and stuff, and I just kind of wrote a little bit code for Android just to get a feeling of how it works.
How was
But
it?
it's very very different from Flutter because in Flutter really you just kind of it's
You just write
seducing.
an app.
It's
I'm
seducing.
guessing.
It's seducing because you just open your IDE and you start writing and you get the result. You don't need to do well. There are some preliminary steps. There is a bit of magic and there's some strange things going on. But to build a simple app, really, I track my time. I know how long stuff takes me. It took me about 40 hours to write my simple application in total. And this includes learning, of course, because I didn't know anything about Flutter. So in 40 hours, you can learn the basics of Flutter and build a simple Hello World app, which is like pretty amazing, I would say. And it just works. With Kotlin multi-platform, I don't know about Alpha, and I know that. I mean, I spoke with folks from IceRock. IceRock is like software development agency from Russia, and you can call them Russian. How do you call them?
I think I actually saw their library. It was very KMM heavy. Don't they have a
Yes,
toolkit
yes,
for
Moko.
KMM?
Yeah, Moko.
Yeah, that's the one. I
Moko.
saw it at some
They are
point.
the authors of Moko, and they're pretty much how what's the company called where Kevin Galligan is working? Like these guys who
TouchLab.
TouchLab, exactly.
TouchLabs.
So IceRock is pretty much TouchLab, a Russian TouchLab, right? They're very similar, and I spoke to their CTO like maybe 1 year ago, 2 years ago. I don't remember. Time flies. And back then they say that they're past 20 or 25 projects with this toolkit. So I'm kind of I think it's not that bad that it's in alpha because at some point I think alpha doesn't mean anything in Android. Everything is in alpha in Android. But
Well,
what disturbs me is that I don't see any
progress?
meaningful progress. Yes, exactly. I don't see any meaningful progress. I would like I mean I would like to see some real breakthrough in this regard because if they compete with Flutter, and that's again something which isn't related to Android or to software engineering at all. These are businesses, and there are billions of dollars at stake here. So Google has Flutter, and Google also invested in KMM. But on the other hand, Google won the Oracle lawsuit. So now they don't actually need, there's no threat of Oracle taking part of this pie from them. And I don't understand why would Google continue their investment into Kotlin multi-platform if they already have Flutter, which is like multi-platform. So yeah, I agree with you that Kotlin multi-platform is a strange beast, to say the least, but for different reasons. I really don't mind the tag that they put on it. And I do know people, like I trust folks from IceRock, they're like real professionals. So I do think that if they use Compose, and Compose, not Compose, Kotlin multi-platform. Yeah, Kotlin multi-platform has this very big benefit that it's not a UI framework. It should be paired with Compose at some point. Like, I mean, from as far as I can tell, it's only a matter of time before we see Compose for iOS. There's like no future.
If they don't, then there's no future for Compose at all.
Exactly. There's no future for Kotlin multi-platform or for, well, not for Kotlin multi-platform, but for Compose multi-platform, which is a completely different entity if they don't provide iOS compatibility, right?
Yep.
So it's very different beast because Kotlin multi-platform, you actually can just write some logic without sharing, without the user interface, which kind of good because sharing user interfaces is hard and it's tricky, and in like it requires a lot of tooling that can break, that can be slow, etc. So it's kind of a benefit, but I don't feel any meaningful progress on the Kotlin multi-platform front, and this kind of disturbs me because
they do claim that in spring 2022, which is this year, they are coming out with beta, and if they are coming out with beta, then that's when I will be more curious about it.
I think maybe they're waiting. My guess would be that they are waiting because it's relatively clear that these things are synchronized. So I would estimate that maybe they are waiting for Compose for iOS. At least some version of Compose for iOS.
That would be really cool, though. I must admit, that would be really cool.
Yeah, because this will... Well, for one, you can write Kotlin and you can write normal code without opting into Flutter world, which is great. And the biggest advantage is that these huge projects that already use Android, already have Android and iOS code bases, right? They wouldn't like to rewrite everything in Flutter. That's like too risky. But if you kind of can start adopting your Android application to run on iOS, that's a totally different story. That's something that you can sell to business people, right? So that's my guess, but I'm real kind of discouraged by the very slow progress and something
I'm
doesn't
actually
work.
Kind of surprised about it, actually, because back when people were jumping on the Kotlin train, they were like, oh, look how fast it's moving. But then it slowed down.
Yeah.
Significantly, actually.
Yeah, and I honestly think that a big chunk of that is related to the fact that Google has no interest in that. And I'm really curious to see how it goes, whether... Well, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. Maybe Google will continue to invest into Kotlin multi-platform. But if not, if my feeling is correct and they are not interested in this path anymore, it will be very interesting to see whether JetBrains can pull that off all by themselves with the help of the communities, guys like Touch Labs and IceRock and whoever else uses Kotlin multi-platform.
I wouldn't mind KMM to be good. I just want it to be like more stable in general. So with the beta coming out, maybe it's gonna be for the better. We'll see.
Yeah, that will be very interesting.
I didn't tell you about Compose navigation. We really need to jump on that.
Yeah, go.
Okay, I will tell you how it works. Okay.
First of all, let's make it. Yeah, before that. We have navigation component for Jetpack, right?
Yes.
So is there any any connection between these, or Jetpack Compose navigation is completely different?
The internals are the same, but in reality, they had to rewrite the whole thing for 2.4.0 to support Compose. So it's more like a whole new library where they kept backwards compatibility with the old one, but they rewrote the entire thing internally.
So today you can use this navigation 2.4, and you can use them with fragments and with composables.
Yes.
Because before that, I remember there were two different frameworks, right?
Well, kind of. Like internally, they were trying to use the same thing. Like there's shared code between them, and well, it's tricky because, well, it has the same core, but to support compose transitions, which I told you earlier, what it takes for it to work, you need to keep track of something that is stopping to exist, but it still exists, right? But the old navigation component, what it did is that you had an action, you executed the action, and it presumed that, hey, the fragment manager will figure this out, and I don't need to care about anything. So they had to add a lot of asynchronicity and state tracking support for these transitions to work. This is basically why navigation 2.4.0 is taking so long, because they are rewriting the entire thing internally to support compose navigation with transitions.
Yeah, navigation in general is very it's a very tricky topic in Android, especially with all these crazy life cycles and
the crazy tooling.
Yeah, and I've just recently had to wrestle once again with dialog fragments.
Oh yeah, me too, actually.
So it's like
I actually like dialog fragments. Like if it doesn't cause problems that you need to work around, that, hey, what's the width and the height of this thing? Because dialog fragment has its own thought process about this. You're like, hey, I want you to be this big, and it's like it's like you don't know what it's gonna be like. You have to explicitly do some tricks.
Exactly.
I was channeling the internals of what the dialog fragment internally feels like when it's like, hey, I just want to ignore your width. I don't care what you want. It's like, dude, what the heck? So
yeah, that, and also if you're like, I discovered that if you're rediscovered it, because I found the code, the hacks to work around that in my older code. I rediscovered that if you are in immersive mode, whatever, when you basically hide the navigations and the status bar, so when you use dialog fragments, you get them back automatically. So you kind of go out of that mode, and you need to implement some hacks, asynchronous hacks, by the way, to restore it. So navigation is difficult, and marrying fragments and marrying compose, I would imagine that that's difficult squared.
It's actually easier. Like if you still use fragments, then it's easy because fragments are established. They work well to the degree that they do, because as you know, screen transitions have always been the bane of fragments. Like they have this thing called a fragment container view, specifically because you couldn't alter the z index of two fragments. So if you wanted to do this animation, then you had to do magic tricks, which, by the way, if you use fragment container view, it only works if you use add to backstack. So I had to like take that as a basis and then hack it around to like make it work, it remove and not add to backstack. So that was fun. But the more important thing here is that, well, where am I going with this? Navigation. So navigation originally was released to make fragment navigation easier. And it also has tagged on activity navigation because it has activity destinations that I don't think anyone really uses. It's really weird. So it was supposed to simplify fragment navigation. As such, it expects that it sends a request for something to be executed, and then the fragment transaction and the fragment manager will figure it out. Compose doesn't have this, so they had to rewrite all the internals. But the API, like I don't even mind the rewrite. If you look at the internals, then it scares you because it's like it has these mutable state flows in random places. Like, why do you even need this? Is this gonna be desynchronized at some point? I don't know. So you have all that. They expose new things like navigator state that never existed. You look at the comments and it's like, yeah, we need to deprecate pop backstack because we need to add this new version of it to support compose navigation. It's full of comments like this. But what's super interesting is what they did with Compose Navigation's API in general, because that's the thing that they intended, that if you have a single activity app, no fragments, just composables, and if you create a compose project, it literally generates a component activity instead of app compat activity, saying that, yeah, we don't think that you will need fragments here. Yeah, let's say that's true, but not really. So the way Compose Navigation works is that they basically looked at Flutter Navigator 1.0 and they're like, this looks like a good idea, let's steal it. So the API works with strings. You concatenate these strings together, and that's the only way to pass data from one string to another. I'm not sure if you got that. String concatenation. You have this query string syntax, URI. Remember when we were told that content providers should expose the underlying data as URIs in your local, from your local SQLi?
Yeah.
I'm getting the same vibes, because you need to use a URI, but it's not really a URI because the API expects a string. But if it doesn't conform to a URI string, then you get bugs. So my favorite point to make about Navigation Compose is that if you're trying to pass one string to another screen and the string contains an and symbol, then it will be parsed incorrectly. Imagine
So
that.
basically, there are many.
You need to manually URL encode the strings that you append to this string that you send as a string, and then you need to instruct the framework, hey, I want to get this thing back as a string, and then you need to URI encode, decode it back. Because
so basically what you're saying, I'm just trying to understand if I understand correctly. When you use Compose Navigation, you don't even deal with parsellables or serializables.
You can't.
You just need to serialize everything as strings, basically, and pass strings around. So if you have an object, a huge object, let's say you want to 100K, you want to pass 100K from one screen to another screen, you will need to pass a string of that length.
A JSON string, yes, indeed. Or, well, technically, I have seen some libraries that say that we are going to support parsellables because, well, it's a completely reasonable expectation to support serializable enum and parcellable arguments, right? Because you were able to do this with bundles, and it was practically as type safe as bundles are, so they made it worse. Okay, so sorry. So what I mean is that there are libraries that generate code to hide this string interaction. They serialize the string for you and then serialize back. And the way these work, and I was very surprised because there was a library. It said, hey, I support parsable arguments. I'm like, how are you doing that? Because I'm kind of curious now, because I have seen people support parsellables by writing into the previous destination's safe state handler to read it from the current one. And like, that makes no sense, dude. That does not work long-term at all or ever. So what this guy did is that they were using parsellable in such a way that you can actually marshal it into a byte array. Like, you can actually convert the parsellable into a byte array. This is how it works internally. You can just say that, hey, I want this to be a byte array, because after all, down under the hood, that's how parsellables are sent, right? So they get this byte array and they convert it into base 64 and they append it to the string. And then when they get it back, then they decode the base 64 and then they use it as a byte array and get the parsellable back. And this is how it works.
Yeah, I wonder if all of this hackery is not just, something you have to do because they want to support a web at some point. Because Flutter supports web, kind of targets web. I don't know what's the state of that. But Compose also wants to support web. And
well, Compose already supports web. The question here is whether Jetpack Navigation wants to support web.
Well, I would estimate that. I mean, again, it's not clear to me at this point what's the state of Compose, Jetpack Compose, and Compose Multiplatform. Because, again, Google does not have any incentive, at least I don't see any incentive for Google to keep on investing into multi-platform aspect of Compose. But assuming that they do, they will need to make this ecosystem interoperable with web, right, at some point.
Well, if they actually succeed with this API, then, well, good luck, I guess. But for now, I'm writing Android applications with Android tooling, and I don't need to serialize to base 64.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
And especially knowing that there's the size limit on parcels, bundles, right? Like, in general, and instead of like minimizing the costs. Like that's why it was a binary protocol in the first place. Now I have to make it base 64 because the navigation framework doesn't support it. I'm like, what?
Yeah, for years they've been saying don't use serializable because it's
Don't
not
even use
performant.
enums.
No, yeah, don't. Okay, that was like a shit show. Like,
Yes.
it was clearly a poor guidance from the onset. But for serializable, people still, I use serializable all the time. People come to me like, why would you use serializable? I'm like, that's the simplest way, and it works. And they're like, but isn't there some performance issue? Like, people actually think about performance between these things, and now you need to serialize everything like Google
to a string.
To a string and back from string. Like, good luck with that performance wise.
Yeah, I don't think people actually like move that to a background thread. So imagine that 100K thing, and that you send it, and then when you get it back as a string, then you actually like also do it on the UI threads. It's like, wow,
that's 100% this will happen. 100%.
Oh, I'm pretty sure it's already happening. Like the Google sample codes are doing it.
Yeah. Okay, I think we need to kind of close that up.
Do we? They actually have multiple backstack support in 2.4, but it only works in a very specific way, and it doesn't support their own deep link navigation handling.
So
that's a trivia question.
You addressed some of the questions?
There was a comment above saying that navigation 2.4 now has multiple backstack. It actually does because because the fragment manager knows nothing about this, but Jetpack navigation actually has this new parameter called save state and restore state. And honestly, I've been trying to figure out how it works, but it's kind of a mystery. So
yeah, the library that I'm using, Fragnav, had that for years.
Yeah. To be honest, the problem itself is hard. Like eventually I wrote a sample where I have multiple backstacks, but you have to work for it. Fragnav already supports this out of the box as far as I know. And now Jetpack Navigation also wants to support it, but anyone who will ever need deep links, especially using their own Jetpack Navigation tooling, that won't work. It's full of to-dos. Guys, it's full of to-dos. It literally has a property saying that, hey, you can actually explicitly disallow this because it's highly experimental. We don't know if it works.
We're not sure about that. Okay, so let's wrap it up. I think, first of all, thank you for providing all this information. You're welcome. Personally, I'm very interested in Compose at a theoretical level at this point. Not sure I will actually invest any time into learning it.
But let's wrap up. I personally would recommend doing what one would do with data binding in this regard, which is that if you encounter a project that uses it, you should know how to use it. And for those people, I need to tell you that in every for loop, you need a key. If you don't have a key, you will have bugs. And if you want to execute side effects of any kind, don't do it as part of the recomposition. Use disposable effect unit. It's the thing. And even if the docs say that don't use disposable effect unit, look at Google source code. It's full of it. Therefore, don't trust the docs.
Well, that's my advice. That's a very reasonable advice in Android world. Don't trust Google Docs.
Honestly, though.
Let's maybe finish our discussion today with kind of a personal question. I remember that you told me once that you started your career as a backend developer.
Yep.
And then you transitioned to Android. So my question would be, how do you feel about being an Android developer today with all this crazy stuff going around? And all of us, or at least most of us, have thoughts about switching to something else, finding more stable, or on contrary, maybe more dynamic ecosystem, something that evolves, living on the bleeding edge, or living in a world of productivity and stability. So where do you stand on that, and how do you feel about being an Android developer in 2022 and going forward?
Oh, this is such a fun question. I need to make sure I don't forget any of the things that came to mind, because one thing, in Hungarian, we have a saying that someone is an old fox. It means that you have been there, you have already seen things. So when you see all these changes made to the ecosystem, then how do you react to that? When you are new and you say, oh, look at all this new stuff, we have Compose, I can switch right over. And then when you are older, then you look at it and you're like, well, that's one more thing we need to learn and know what kind of quirks it has. But to be honest, I like being an Android developer. I do like native Android. And funnily enough, I actually like the life cycle by now. Like, I think it makes sense if you don't misuse it. Like, all the bugs that people attribute to, hey, fragments are wrong. Hey, the activity life cycle is complicated. Well, you can mitigate that by like having one activity, by using fragments as intended. Like, and by knowing that when Google deprecated some things like view pager 1 most explicitly, because why would you even do that? And like deprecating target fragments, that's something that's like, you're like, if you are old and you know what's going on, then you know that you can just ignore this deprecation. Even Jake Wharton said, we just ignore the deprecation warning on last custom non-configuration instance. We use it every day. And I'm like, yeah, that makes perfect sense. It's not like they can remove it without breaking every code that relies on it. So they're not going to do that. It takes no effort for them to support it, so they won't remove it.
Yeah, I think many Android developers have kind of, how do you call it? When you are split inside yourself, when cognitive dissonance, when they hear Jake Wharton saying that they don't use view models and they use set retain.
They don't use fragments. They don't use fragments. They don't use view models, but they do use Jetpack Compose. But they have a custom compiler plugin on it written by Jake Wharton. Yeah, so that's a different world.
Too bad. Not every company has a Jake Wharton inside. Okay, so your experience, your thoughts as being an Android developer.
Oh yeah, so what you tend to say this, that now in 2021, it's never been more difficult to actually become an Android developer. This is what you tend to say, and I wholeheartedly agree. I'm pretty sure you said this in the Native State of Android Development 2021 post, and I definitely agree, because as we know, there's a new standard saying that, hey, I'm the new competing standard that will handle every case, but that's just one new standard. So what do we have now? Now we have Android with multiple activities. If you have some really legacy code, you have multiple fragments, but using fragment transactions directly. You have stuff that nobody even remembers, like Pilot or Flow and Mortar or stuff like that. You have Jetpack Navigation, which has both the Java edition, it had the Kotlin DSL edition with the IDs and the actions and stuff, but now the Kotlin DSL version has only roots because the DSL version lived a year. Now it's deprecated, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It's going to be right there. You might be unlucky enough to encounter Enco layouts because people are like, hey, this will make views
You do
easier.
realize that I asked you this question for you to encourage everyone.
No. I'm gonna encourage everyone by the end.
Not to list all the bad things.
Oh, sorry about that. Well,
children might be listening to this podcast.
Oops, I did not consider that. I should not have mentioned Enco. Okay. Okay, but for real though, so there are all these things, data binding, all that. You have Java projects, Kotlin projects. I saw one using Java 11 features. I didn't even know you can do that, like, because the desugaring supports it. So at that point, you're like, there's all these things that you might need to know, but you don't actually need to know. It only matters for that one project that you're joining, right? That's the one you need to like bring yourself up to speed on. So if that's Compose based, you need to know Compose. You need to know about keys, disposable effects. You need to understand recomposition to some degree. You need to understand what it means for all state to be two-way data bound. If you have data binding in a project, then try to remove it and replace it with ViewBinding if you can. But most importantly, though, I do enjoy it. I actually do, because multiple reasons, but mostly because the ecosystem is, it doesn't seem like it, but it's fairly stable. Like once you know the quirks, it's pretty satisfying to write code that you know is stable. So my trick in this case, self-plug, is that we use simple stack with Rx, right, with fragments. sometimes used, but typically with fragments. So we have this toolkit. I also have this library called Combine Tuple. And with Rx, Combine Tuple, Simple Stack, we create stuff that we know works. We know it works because Simple Stack handles the lifecycle and navigation and screen-based, data sharing between screens. We have Rx for propagating the state. So whether it's views or compose, honestly, does not matter. It's the same thing for us. Like the only difference there is whether it's a layout XML with constraint layout or frame layout, or I'm specifically saying this to ensure people that no, you don't need to use constraint layout everywhere. That's not a good idea. So there are all these things you can know, but once you have stable ground, like you have an ecosystem in place that just works, and you don't go down these rabbit holes like MVI that literally just make your code more complex, harder to read, harder to understand, introduce more bugs, and just make it into arcanery instead of code. Well, if you avoid pitfalls, then you can create products that people use, and then you hear from other people, hey, I use this app and it's pretty good. And like, hey, I actually wrote that. And they're like, whoa, really? Yeah, really. And that's always satisfying.
Okay, so you like the challenge and you think that Android development is actually relatively stable.
It actually kind of is, yeah.
And you forgot to mention the community, right?
Yes, I did. There is indeed a community, and we all simultaneously try to solve the problem of stability. We are trying to ensure that things work. And yeah, the community is great. It really is. Like, especially if you compare it with something like iOS, where is there even a community? Like, I don't even know. Flutter has a community,
yes,
but
there
it's
is,
smaller.
there is, but it's
There is?
much. Yeah, there is a community on iOS. There are like people, but I mean, the nature of iOS is that it's much less fun. They're not as fun as us here in Android world.
We chat about stuff about Android for 2 hours, and it's fun. It's always fun.
Yeah, and they don't have Google to bitch about, because
Yes.
Apple is like, you get what you get and that's it.
Yeah. At least you have options, and if you don't like it, you can just write your own code. Like Simple Stack, it initially started out as a proof of concept, but in reality, it ended up as like an actual framework that people actually use. And when I hear people talk about it, they're like, "Hey, this framework actually fixed all my problems with Android development," and I'm like, "That's always amazing to hear."
Yeah, I need some time to just try your Simple Stack.
Multiple backstacks is harder, but yeah.
I actually haven't like my like, you don't have multiple backstacks in payment projects. They are very conservative, usually UI wise.
The most notable project I worked on was also a payment app for a bank, and they were really happy with their product, especially as it's the same one that inherited all that stuff that just didn't work. Like we replaced navigation, which was some custom single activity thing in that project. We replaced it with Simple Stack, and we found a thread safety issue. They were trying to navigate from a background thread, and Simple Stack verifies this. It's like, hey, you are trying to talk to me from a wrong thread, please don't. And so they had a bunch of hacks and comments saying that sometimes this doesn't work, and they never figured out that this is why. So yeah, I fix bugs I don't know about, guys.
Well, I think you are as being, I mean, I constantly hear people talk about the fact that you help and you always answer their questions, and honestly, I don't know where you find the time to do that. Because even
Gradle builds.
Yeah, I mean, I do that professionally, and even in sometimes I feel a little bit overwhelmed. So like, hats off to you for even trying to do that, and you don't even have anything to market. So let's market your work, shall we? First of all, you can find that's Gabor's GitHub, and you just say that you use Simple Stack and some other project which I didn't hear properly. Which one of these?
Simple Stack is the
you
one.
have Guide to Kotlin.
I have Guide to Kotlin for people who are like who know Java. If you read through the wiki, you will know Kotlin. It's true.
Yeah, so that's basically, by the way, I learned Kotlin's quirks, many of them from your guide, right? So I've been
Nice.
very basic Kotlin user, and then when I decided that I want to try it professionally, I went for your guide and read a lot of it. And if I remember correctly, there used to be some buy me a coffee button here, no?
It was there for like a week and it's not there anymore.
Too bad, too bad. So put that back
Ah,
and
okay.
let people thank you for your efforts. And then we have SimpleStack, which is your navigation framework, right?
Yep. Yep.
And you mentioned one other library that you use. Which
Yes,
one?
it's Rx combine tuple KT, and I don't know why it's not a pinned library. I guess it's because I have the live data variant there, but the one I actually use in production is the Rx one.
Combine tuple KT.
Yes, this one is wonderful.
Okay, so what does it do?
It's really just a wraparound combine latest so that you can use the destructuring those parentheses around the T1, T through T2, T3. I cannot talk. With that, I can combine 16 up to 16 observables and get them in a type safe way. While with well, if you look at the actual source code, you see what I'm hiding here. So I think we can actually do that. Let's show people that you can actually look at the project and see what it does.
Well, let's try to do that. We have maybe
It's
10
super
minutes.
simple. Combine
Rx
tuple.
combine.
Yeah, this one. So this is the code that you don't need to write because Kotlin, as combine latest has all these the multiple arguments. It's not sure if you want to pass in f4 or a function for. So you have to explicitly say that, yeah, I actually am passing the lambda as a function here, guys. I'm trying to pass it, okay? So that would normally not work. You need to specify all those generics, but now you don't because I wrote this. So just the other day I needed one with 17. That was a struggle, but eventually I ended up with like 12 plus 5, so it worked.
Okay, so hopefully people who still use Rx or will use Rx in the future will find that useful.
I think this is like the most fundamental thing to reactive state design. Like if you have this, you don't need all these intermediate classes. Like what was his name? I think it was Gabriel Peel who said that the reason why they are not doing the multiple live data, multiple behavior relay approach is because the combination complexity is too high. But this kills that complexity. You just say combine and you get all the properties at once. So that's great.
So folks who use Rx, take a look at Rx combine tuple KT from
I
Gabor.
also have one for live data and flow.
Yeah, so he has for everything. And of course, that's Gabor's profile on Twitter, where he is very active. And go follow Gabor on Twitter. So anything else which, and by the way, if you look at Twitter, that's his handle. Anything else which I forgot where people can find you, follow, and ask questions?
Ask questions. Yeah, if you send me stuff on Twitter, then if I know the answer, you will get an answer. So so that works. That's the easiest way to find me, actually.
So Twitter is the official support for getting help for
that's
support
where
channel for Gabor.
That's where I got the question about the compose runtime internal error, and the solution was that the modifier had used composed, and I'm not sure what it does, but that's the thing that broke it. So that's what we know.
Okay, so I think it's a wrap. I learned a lot of new things. Actually, each time we talk, I learn a lot of new things. So I have something to try out next, and hopefully it will be useful to others. And thank you for agreeing to talk to me.
You are welcome. Let's do this again sometime.
Yeah, I think as long as both of us are interested in Android development, it's inevitable.
Nice.
Yeah. So see you around.
See ya.
Bye, everybody.